It was a few years back, during the last stretch of my time living with my parents before leaving for college, when life took a strange turn. My parents had just bought a new house, moving us far away from the city and even the outer suburbs. The new place sat in the middle of dense woods, isolated and quiet as though the world itself had forgotten it existed. To me, it felt enormous, almost like a mansion, especially compared to the smaller homes we had lived in before. Although it was only the three of us under that roof most of the time, my parents often justified the size by reminding me that relatives frequently stayed over. That seemed to be their excuse for purchasing a house so much larger than we realistically needed. Regardless, this particular week was different. My parents had flown out of state to visit family, leaving me behind. They offered to bring me along, but I declined. School was still in session, and I couldn't afford to miss classes, catch-up assignments, and exams. I volunteered to house sit instead. What I hadn't realized at the time was how unsettling the house could feel when I was alone in it. From the moment we moved in, I knew the place carried an aura that didn't sit right with me. The endless hallways stretched out like veins, lined with countless doors leading into dark, unused rooms. Even when everything was still and silent, it always felt like someone was just out of sight. Adding to that unease was the house's age, over a century old. It creaked with a voice of its own, every shift in the wood echoing as though the walls themselves whispered. I tried to ignore those feelings most days, brushing them aside as childish nerves, but they never truly went away. The first 2 days without my parents passed without incident. I followed my usual routine: school, hanging out with friends afterward, and returning home in the evenings. The house, though unnervingly empty, seemed harmless enough. But on the third evening, everything began to change. That night, after grabbing dinner with some friends, I pulled into the driveway around 6:30. Darkness had already settled over the forest, wrapping the house in shadow. I was exhausted, the kind of tired that makes you want to collapse straight into bed. I kicked my shoes off, dropped my backpack by the front door, and started up the long staircase to the second floor. That's when I noticed it. Down the main upstairs hallway, one of the spare bedroom doors stood wide open. My stomach tightened immediately. I didn't remember leaving it that way. Normally, I always preferred the doors shut. Passing by so many open rooms in that massive house unsettled me, as though any one of them could be hiding something. Trying to shake off the unease, I walked down the hall and peeked inside. The room was empty, just a bed, a dresser, and a few old chairs. Nothing seemed disturbed. I closed the door firmly and reminded myself I must have overlooked it earlier. Yet a thought gnawed at me. I walked that hallway several times a day. How could I not have noticed? Still, I forced myself to brush it off. Before settling in, I did a quick walkthrough of the house. I didn't check every room, but I looked for anything obviously wrong. Open windows, shifted furniture, anything that would explain the uneasy feeling crawling across my skin. I found nothing. Maybe the door had swung open on its own. After all, the house was old, and not all of the doors latched properly. I told myself that was the answer. I returned to my room at the far end of the hallway, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But the thought lingered. I was alone in a 100-year-old mansion in the woods, surrounded by endless rooms I couldn't possibly keep track of. The unease didn't fade. It deepened. After about an hour, hunger pulled me downstairs to the kitchen. That's when the atmosphere of the house really pressed in on me. In a place this large, you never had all the lights on at once. Entire sections of the home remained swallowed in darkness, while I moved through patches of dim glow. From the corner of my eye, I swore I saw shapes shifting in the living room. Every time I turned my head, the room was silent, empty, dark. Shadows, I told myself. Just shadows and nerves. I made myself dinner and started back upstairs, but as soon as I stepped onto the second floor, I froze. The spare room door was open again. A chill crawled over me, locking my body in place. I stared down that long hallway for a full minute, my heart thudding. Had I really closed it before? I remembered the click of the latch beneath my hand. My throat went dry. The thought I'd always brushed aside, that maybe the house was haunted, suddenly didn't feel so laughable. Forcing myself to move, I walked toward the room, pushed the door open wider, and looked inside. The same plain furniture, the same stillness, nothing out of place. I searched for signs, footprints, shifted blankets, anything, but found nothing. Still unsettled, I returned to my own room, shut the door, and this time, locked it. I texted my parents, asking casually if they had ever noticed that door opening on its own. They replied quickly, no, they hadn't. I told them not to worry, it was probably nothing, but my gut screamed otherwise. Something was wrong. 10 minutes later, sitting on my bed with the TV flickering in the background, I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. I grabbed the remote and muted the TV just in time to hear a distinct thump right outside my door. My pulse raced, ears straining in the silence. Then came the sound that froze every muscle in my body. A soft, deliberate knock. Not hurried, not frantic. Slow, calm, patient. I couldn't breathe. For what felt like a full minute, nothing followed. The silence grew heavier by the second until I finally found the courage to speak. My voice cracked as I called out, "Who's out there? I've already called the cops." It was a lie, but I hoped it might scare them away. The only reply was 3 more soft knocks. My hands shook as I finally did what I'd bluffed. I called the police. The operator's voice steadied me as I whispered my address, describing how someone was right outside my door. Just as I said it, a sharp sound sliced through the silence. A long, dragging scratch against the wood like a knife carving slowly across the surface. I begged the dispatcher to hurry. The doorknob rattled violently, but thank God I had locked it. Another pause, then 3 more slow, deliberate knocks. The next 10 minutes felt like hours, but eventually, the flashing lights of patrol cars cut through the windows. I shouted for help, and when the officers rushed upstairs, the hallway was empty. Whoever had been outside my door was gone. All that remained was a jagged gash carved deep into the wood of my bedroom door, proof that it hadn't been my imagination. The police searched the house, but with its countless doors, old locks, and multiple entrances, it was impossible to secure every corner. No real leads ever surfaced. My parents cut their trip short and came home immediately. Though nothing else happened after that night, I never felt safe in that house again. The dark hallways seemed to watch me. The woods pressed closer, more suffocating than ever. A week later, I could have sworn I saw someone standing among the trees staring at the house, but when I blinked, the shape was gone. Thankfully, I don't live there anymore. My parents sold the place just a couple of months ago, but I still wonder, was it the house itself? Or was someone really inside with me that night, waiting in the shadows of all those dark, empty rooms? Friday nights were always my little escape. After working the entire week in the city, an hour-long commute each way, I'd finally make it back to my tiny suburban home with one goal: relax and do absolutely nothing. That particular night was no different. I had planned it out in my head the entire drive home. A shower, a few beers, gaming on the PlayStation, maybe some late-night YouTube until I fell asleep. The routine began exactly as expected. I dropped my bag by the door, tossed my keys onto the counter, and headed straight for the shower. Hot water, steam, and silence washed away the stress of the week. By the time I collapsed onto the couch, controller in hand, I already felt a new person. I gamed for hours, letting myself unwind. A couple beers in, I was buzzing just enough to feel carefree, but not completely out of it. At some point, I paused and realized the only thing missing was food, specifically pizza. I opened the app for a small local shop I'd ordered from plenty of times before. Within minutes, I had my order placed and confirmation sent. I imagined that perfect moment: hot cheese, a fresh slice in one hand, controller in the other, YouTube playing in the background, the definition of comfort. But after 45 minutes, I realized something was off. My phone hadn't buzzed with an update, and my stomach was starting to complain. Pulling the app up, I saw a vague notification about a delay. Nothing specific, just a polite apology and reassurance that my order would be on the way soon. I shrugged it off. It wasn't the end of the world, and honestly, I was trying to stay up late anyway. Still, the beers and long week caught up with me. My eyelids grew heavy, YouTube chatter humming in the background, and before I knew it, I dozed off on the couch. The sharp, insistent sound of the doorbell startled me awake. It wasn't just once, it was multiple rings, urgent enough to jolt me out of my half-dream state. I sat up quickly, heart racing, brain foggy. The pizza guy. I must have been out longer than I realized, leaving him waiting outside like an idiot. I staggered toward the door, still groggy from the nap and the alcohol. When I opened it, a man stood on my porch. I didn't even hesitate. "Sorry, I hope you weren't waiting long. How much do I owe you?" I mumbled, rubbing my eyes. The man tilted his head, almost confused by the question. Only then did I notice he wasn't carrying any pizza boxes, no insulated bag, no uniform, nothing to indicate he was delivering food. Just dark jeans, a gray hoodie pulled over his head, and both hands shoved deep into his pockets. "For the pizzas," I clarified. "How much?" The words hung in the air, and for an uncomfortable stretch of silence he didn't respond. Then he smiled faintly, an unsettling curve of his lips. "Don't worry," he said. "They're still on the way." That was it, nothing else. Just that strange, meaningless reassurance. Even in my half-drunk, half-asleep haze, I knew something about the exchange was wrong. Why would he be here empty-handed if the food wasn't ready yet? But I nodded dumbly and muttered, "Okay," before closing the door. I leaned against it, rubbing my face as my mind tried to clear. The interaction replayed in my head, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. Maybe I was exaggerating, maybe I was just too tired to think clearly. I let it go, sat back down on the couch and put on another video. Once again, exhaustion claimed me. The next time I woke, it wasn't to the doorbell. It was a sound, a clicking noise. I froze, listening, waiting for another knock or ring, but none came. The video on the TV was still playing, so I knew I hadn't been asleep long. Still, something about that clicking nagged at me. Groggily, I pulled out my phone, planning to check the app for updates again. But the lock screen stopped me cold. It was 4 a.m. I'd placed my order just after 11 now. The pizza shop closed at 1 mo. Heart pounding, I checked the app anyway. My order had been delayed for an hour before the restaurant canceled it completely. The realization slammed into me. The man at my door couldn't have been a delivery driver. I got up and walked to the front door, peering through the peephole. The street was empty. Silence pressed against the glass, the kind of silence only the suburbs knew at that hour. Reaching down, I gripped the lock and froze again. It was already unlocked. I remembered how groggy I'd been earlier, how quickly I closed the door without thinking. Had I really forgotten to lock it? Slowly, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood was still. No cars passing, no footsteps, no one waiting. Just the stillness of pre-dawn hours. But as I closed the door again, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoed sharply in my ears. It was the same sound that had woken me earlier. My stomach dropped. He'd been inside. The entire conversation replayed in my mind, and the horrifying truth clicked into place. He hadn't claimed to be the delivery driver. I had said it first, and he'd simply gone along with it, smiling, waiting. Why? What did he want? My body moved on instinct. I crept toward the living room, reaching for my phone on the couch. But before I could grab it, a noise came from the other room. A faint shift, like someone stepping on a floorboard. Panic surged through me. I snatched my phone and bolted. My bare feet slapped against the hallway floor as I sprinted for the front door. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to check. I ran outside into the cool night air, down the block until I reached the corner. Only then did I dial 911, breathless and shaking. The dispatcher's voice steadied me, but every second until the squad cars arrived felt unbearable. By the time the flashing red and blue lights washed over the street, the intruder was gone. I gave the officers everything. His appearance, his strange words, the way he stood there like he belonged. But there were no leads, no signs of forced entry, just my unlocked door and my memory of the sound that woke me. Even now I can't stop thinking about it. Maybe it was just terrible coincidence. The canceled pizza order, the strange man, the timing, or maybe he was watching me, waiting for an opportunity. The part that haunts me most is imagining what could have happened if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't noticed the sound. If I'd stayed asleep on that couch, leaving my door unlocked, too tired and drunk to react. I picture him slipping inside, standing over me, patient and silent, waiting for the right moment. And I know that night could have ended very differently.
In mid-2019, I packed up the little I owned and moved to a new town for work. At that point in my life, I had very little money to spare, so I settled for the cheapest place I could find. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom unit tucked into the second floor of an aging apartment complex with only 4 apartments total. The buildings looked as if they hadn't been updated in decades. The siding faded and cracked, the hallways carrying that faint, sour odor of water damage and old paint. The area itself wasn't much better. Still, I told myself it was temporary, just long enough to save some money and stabilize myself in the new job. For the first 3 months, I was the only tenant there. The other 3 units remained empty, their windows dark and lifeless no matter the hour. At first, the silence was nice, but soon it began to feel oppressive, like I was living in an abandoned place where no one was supposed to be. Every time I walked up those creaking wooden stairs, I felt exposed, as though someone could be watching me from the vacant windows. But I ignored the unease. Work was already stressful enough. Long nights, endless overtime, a tense office environment that drained me daily. By the time I stumbled back to my apartment each evening, I barely had the energy to eat before collapsing into bed. One night, around 8 p.m., I dragged myself home after yet another grueling day. I slipped off my shoes in the dim entryway and headed down the narrow hall toward my bedroom when a sudden knock rattled my front door. I froze, my exhaustion instantly replaced by a rush of adrenaline. I hadn't seen anyone outside on my way in, and no one should have known I was home yet. Slowly, I walked back to the door and glanced through the peephole, only to find it useless. The glass was cloudy, scratched, maybe even cracked. I could make out nothing but vague shapes. Against my better judgment, I unlatched the lock and pulled the door open. Standing uncomfortably close was a man, late 40s to early 50s, with dark, uneven stubble and hair that looked greasy under the yellow porch light. But it was his eyes that caught me, wide, intense, unsettling in a way I couldn't place.
Can I help you? I asked, gripping the door tightly. His expression brightened, his eyes widening even further. Do you live here? He asked. The question was strange, but I nodded cautiously. Yeah. A grin spread across his face, crooked and almost too eager. I just moved in next door. Thought I'd introduce myself. He raised his hand in a half-hearted wave, then turned and walked to the unit beside mine, unlocking the door and stepping inside. He never offered his name, nor any details, just that grin and that odd question. Still, I tried to shrug it off. After all, having another tenant in the complex should have been comforting, better than living in a ghost building alone. That night I ate quickly and went to bed early, pushing the strange encounter to the back of my mind. The next evening, I came home at the same time. As I climbed the outdoor stairs, I noticed a slight movement from the neighboring window. The blinds swayed, just enough to reveal that someone had been standing there, watching. My stomach sank. I quickened my pace and slipped into my unit, locking the door behind me. I told myself not to overthink it, that maybe he had just been curious, but I barely had time to set down my bag before another knock echoed from the door. I sighed, already knowing who it was. Peering through the useless peephole again gave me nothing, so I opened it. Sure enough, there he stood, same greasy stubble, same hollow eyes. Is there something you need? I asked carefully, trying not to sound irritated. I'm kind of in a rush. He ignored my tone. Would you happen to know how the thermostat works in these units? Must be getting too old to figure it out, he said with a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. It was a simple question, but I couldn't shake the unease prickling at the back of my neck. Still, I explained the basics. Just a couple of buttons, hardly complicated. He nodded, smiling, but then insisted I come over to show him, claiming he'd already tried what I described. I really don't have the time right now, I replied. He apologized, but it felt forced, his tone laced with something almost passive-aggressive. He pressed again, telling me it would only take 30 seconds.
And gesturing down the walkway toward his door. The winter air was sharp and cold, and guilt gnawed at me. If his heat truly wasn't working, he could freeze in there. Against my instincts, I finally gave in. Fine. 30 seconds. We walked toward his unit, his pace slightly ahead of mine. The door was already ajar. When he stepped inside, I hesitated at the threshold. My stomach turned instantly. The apartment was empty. Not sparsely furnished, completely barren. No boxes, no couch, no sign of anyone actually living there. The walls were peeling, the carpet stained, the air thick with a rotting, acrid smell that made my eyes water. I froze. This place wasn't rented. This place hadn't been touched in months. The man turned back, his smile still plastered across his face. Come on, it's just over here. Every instinct screamed at me to back away. I stammered, searching for an excuse, but he repeated the invitation, this time in a tone that shifted from falsely friendly to something darker, colder. His face hardened, and with a sudden step forward, he closed the distance between us. I bolted. My body moved before my mind caught up. I sprinted back to my apartment, slammed the door shut, and twisted the locks. My chest heaved as I grabbed my phone. Seconds later, the handle of my door rattled violently. He was trying to get in. My fingers fumbled over the keypad as I dialed the police. From the other side, his voice rang out, sickeningly calm. Hey, what's wrong? I just need a little help. Don't be like that. The knocking continued, deliberate and steady. My heart pounded as I whispered details to the dispatcher. Then, silence. I stood frozen, phone pressed to my ear, straining to hear. For a long moment, I thought he was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling he was standing there, listening, waiting. By the time the police arrived, the hallway was empty. They checked the unit next door and confirmed my worst suspicion. It was still officially vacant. The man had broken in and had been staying there for days, likely observing my comings and goings, waiting for the right opportunity. I don't like to think about what would have happened had I stepped inside that apartment. Maybe I wouldn't have walked back out. I moved out within the week, breaking my lease without a second thought. Even now, years later, whenever I catch sight of a vacant building, I feel that same icy fear crawl up my spine, reminding me of the man who waited in the dark.